A racist white woman makes fun of a black man on a plane, and she is shocked when she finds out who the black man really is. A man named Tom Johnson boarded flight 287 and peered down the aisle. The plane was already very busy. As people put their bags in the overhead bins, he walked past a few travelers still standing and muttered, "Excuse me." As he made his way to his place near the emergency exit, Tom said, "Excuse me." Karen White watched from a few rows back. She had seen him over the top of her magazine as soon as he stepped on the plane. His calm manner had caught her eye. As he sat down and checked his bag, she watched him with wide eyes. There was something about him that she couldn't quite pinpoint. She nervously tapped her fingers on the seat as she pretended to read the paper in front of her, even though she wasn't. Karen spoke quietly, raising her hand as she spoke. As Linda, the flight attendant, walked by, she stopped and smiled politely. "Yes, ma'am. How may I assist you?" He looked at Tom for a moment as he turned the pages of his book. The man was standing near the emergency exit. I whispered to Linda, "Is it truly safe to have it?" Someone like him sitting there. Linda looked in the same direction as Karen. Tom was reading a book quietly. His smile never wavered. "Ma'am, I promise you that everyone on board has been through security, and our seating plans are in line with..." Karen's lips tightened as she uttered, "I just assumed you were familiar with safety rules." "It's better to be careful with everything you hear on the news these days, right?" Linda kept her sweet smile on, even though her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Please let me know if there's anything specific you're worried about." She politely nodded and continued down the aisle. "Let me know that we want all of our passengers to feel safe and comfortable," he said. Karen watched Linda walk away, and she felt irritated. How could the flight attendant be so rude? Shook her head and looked back at Tom, who had picked up his book and was now reaching into her mind, began to race as she searched through his bag. What was he looking for? What could he be hiding? She shifted in her seat uncomfortably. Unaware of the attention, Tom took out his medicine and read the label, unable to take his eyes off it. After a moment, he put it back in the bag and resumed his reading. He could feel the calm slowly washing over him. He tried to get away from the stress of the week, so he didn't notice that Linda was moving behind him. She continued to do her pre-flight checks as she walked down the aisle. When she got to the back of the plane, she looked at her and smiled. She whispered to her co-worker Jim, "Pay attention to seat 18C. The person in 22A seems a little upset about him." Jim nodded and asked, "What's the..." Linda gave a light shrug. It wasn't a specific thought. It was just one of those gut feelings. We believe she attempted to suppress her unease because she had experienced enough plane travel to recognize the warning signs of trouble. It's still too early to determine if this was one of those cases. Karen shifted in her seat once more, and her eyes narrowed. I watched Tom as the plane's engines grew louder, signaling the impending takeoff. Tom put down his book and looked out the window. His face was a picture of calm. Karen's mind, on the other hand, was anything but calm. She tightened her grip on the armrests. As the plane taxied down the runway, she gripped the armrests, trying to shake off the feeling of fear that had settled in her chest. Even though Karen leaned back, she never took her eyes off of Tom. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Since no one else was willing to assist, she might have to take the initiative herself. The plane took off and leveled off. The captain's voice was heard over the speaker, welcoming everyone on board and they presented an outline of the flight plan. The seatbelt sign went off, and people began to adjust to their new routines. Some people chose to watch movies or read books on their computers, while flight attendants moved through the aisles. While tending to the guests and serving refreshments, Tom Johnson reclined in his chair and gazed out the window. As the clouds went by, he felt the stress in his shoulders start to go away. He took off his carry-on bag. He took out a small water bottle. As he did this, he caught a glimpse of Karen, her eyes fixed on him. He stopped for a moment. He considered it briefly before dismissing it, assuming she was simply observing the surroundings, similar to many others who were seated a few rows behind Karen. She felt even worse as she watched Tom carefully zip up his bag again, having removed the water bottle. What was he doing? She found it peculiar that he continued to inspect the bag, seemingly to ensure its safety, while she was hiding within it. She noticed that most of the other passengers were preoccupied with their own concerns and unaware of what she perceived as a potential future. Threat couldn't get rid of her unease, so Karen called out to flight attendant Linda. Linda saw the threat, and Linda walked up with a smile and a raised hand. "Yes, ma'am. Is there anything you need?" she asked in a friendly voice. Karen leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper to avoid drawing attention to the man up there, one near the emergency exit. "I've been watching him, and he keeps looking at his bag like he's worried about something. I really think you should look into it," Linda said. Linda looked at Tom and then back at Karen. Her face stayed the same. "Stay calm. I know you're worried, ma'am, but as I said before, unless there's a clear sign of something, we can't look through other people's bags for no reason." He hasn't caused any trouble, and his behavior made Karen's face tense up. "Normal? How can you say that? People who like him always act normal until they've seen it on the news, so we're at a loss for action. What if it contains something dangerous?" Linda kept her cool. Her training was paying off. "Mum, we have implemented security measures for everyone involved," she stated. "The flight has gone through screening. Please try to relax and enjoy the flight. If you notice anything more concrete, let us know." "No," Karen huffed. She crossed her arms and murmured under her breath, "You people never take things seriously until it's too late." Breath, Linda heard the comment but chose not to respond. She gave Karen a polite nod and continued down the aisle, attempting to shake off the conversation. Her years of experience taught her to handle such situations with caution, but this was starting to feel different. There was a certain intensity in Karen's eyes, a determination that made Linda uneasy. Linda walked past Tom's seat, casting a quick, casual glance at him. Tom, feeling the brief shift of attention, looked up and met her eyes. Linda smiled politely, and he nodded in return, the moment ebbing away without words. Karen's concern felt so pressing because it wasn't the first time she'd encountered a nervous or suspicious person. However, something about this situation nagged at her. Karen watched Linda walk away, feeling frustrated and annoyed. Unheard, she glanced around at the other passengers, some of whom had glanced her way during their exchange. Returned to their own activities, seemingly unbothered, Karen's frustration intensified. Feeling complacent, she leaned over to her neighbor, a middle-aged woman engrossed in a magazine. "Excuse me," Karen whispered. "Did you notice that man near the exit? Doesn't he seem off to you?" The woman glanced up, surprised by the suddenness of his response to her question. She glanced over at Tom, who had resumed his book reading. "I don't know," she replied hesitantly. "He looks fine to me. What's the problem?" Karen frowned, feeling a flicker of irritation at the woman's nonchalance about his acting. "He has been acting suspiciously since we boarded, constantly checking his bag as if he's hiding something. I tried to inform the flight attendant, but they didn't seem to care. Isn't it preferable to take precautions rather than risk the consequences?" The woman glanced again at Tom, then back at Karen. "Really a problem. The crew would handle it." "I'm sure it's nothing," she said, turning back to her magazine. Karen clenched her jaw, frustration building. It was clear to her now if no one else was going to take this seriously, she would. She had to keep her eyes on Tom, determined not to let him out of her sight. She watched every movement, waiting. She was looking for any indication that would validate her concerns. Unaware of Karen's scrutiny, Tom intermittently continued reading. He happily lost himself in his book, taking a sip of water. The steady hum of the plane's engines was a comforting backdrop. His thoughts drifted to his upcoming meeting in Los Angeles and the case he was working on. Just a few rows behind him, someone's growing suspicion was about to turn into something much more disruptive. Her unease grew with every passing minute as her mind replayed news stories and events, each adding weight to her fears. She felt her pulse. Quicken was convinced that danger was imminent, and she prepared to wait, watch, and be ready should Tom make a mistake. She would be the first to act. The cabin of Flight 287 was filled with the usual sounds of a long-haul flight, the hum of the engines. With the sound of pages turning and the occasional clink of a drink cart, the majority of passengers were at ease. Karen White was either lost in their in-flight entertainment or dozing off, but her eyes remained fixed on Tom. Every time Tom reached down to check his bag, Johnson's irritation and suspicion grew by the minute. Karen felt the heat rising in her cheeks and her mind racing. This wasn't normal. No one had checked their bag. Often, unless they had something to hide, she felt a responsibility to act, but each time she considered confronting him, she addressed him directly, unsure of the reaction she might provoke. She whispered to the elderly man sitting next to her, trying to keep her voice down. "Excuse me. Have you noticed the man?" Sitting near the emergency exit, the elderly man keeps checking his bag. "Doesn't that seem strange to you?" He stood up from his crossword puzzle, squinting through his glasses, and glanced in Tom's direction before quickly returning his focus. To his puzzle, he said dismissively, "I hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary." "I'm sure it's nothing Karen's doing." Her frustration grew. How could everyone be so blind? She looked around, hoping to catch the eye of another passenger. She needed someone to validate her fears in order to see what she saw, and her gaze fell on a young woman sitting across the aisle. She appeared to be observing Tom with a hint of excitement. Karen leaned over and spoke in a hushed tone. "Excuse me, do you see that? Doesn't the man near the exit seem off to you, like he's hiding something?" The young woman glanced at Tom, then returned her attention to Karen. Her expression was polite but bored. "I don't know," she said slowly. "I think he's just reading his. There's something wrong." Karen's patience snapped. "Yes, there is. He's been acting strange since we boarded. He keeps checking. That bag of his appears to contain something dangerous. Despite informing the flight attendant, no action has been taken about it." The young woman shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Maybe it's best to leave it to the flight crew. They've received training for situations like this, correct?" Karen's voice rose, is attracting some attention from other people. "What if it's too late by then? What if something happens and we could have stopped it? I'm not the only one who feels this way." Her tone was firm, trying to rally support from those around her. A few riders turned to look at Tom. He remained unaware of the attention, keeping his posture relaxed while reading. Linda, the flight attendant, noticed a growing number of heads were turning and moving toward Karen's seat. She leaned down, her voice low but firm. "Ma'am, please keep your voice down. We don't want to disturb other passengers." Karen gestured. She looked at Tom with a determined face and said, "I've been telling you that man is acting suspiciously. He's checking his bag over and over. I know he's up to something." Linda took a deep breath and kept her cool. "I've already talked to you about this, ma'am, but we can't get involved without proof of a threat. Could you please calm down? I assure you that we are closely monitoring the situation." Karen's voice grew louder, breaking through the silence. "Monitoring cabin noise. What does that even mean? Are you just going to wait for something bad to happen? That's not good enough." People started to mutter, some looking worried and others looking annoyed at Tom. He finally raised his gaze, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. For a moment, his eyes met Karen's, and a confused look crossed his face. Face it. Linda noticed that Karen was receiving a lot of attention and knew she needed to calm down quickly. You're worried, but raising your voice and scaring other people on the plane won't help. Please calm down, voice, or I'll have to get the captain involved. Karen suddenly stood up, her face red with anger. No, you don't. I know you're all blind, but something is amiss, and I'm not going to stand by and do nothing. Her voice was sharp and cutting. Though the cabins were mostly quiet, more heads turned and whispers began to spread among the guests. Linda put her hand on Karen's and tried to push her back into her seat and said, "Ma'am, please sit down. Let's talk about this calmly." Linda took her hand off of Tom's and pointed it straight at him. He's hiding something. She demanded that they search his bag immediately. His eyes grew a little bigger as he looked around at the gathering crowd and then back at Karen. He put down his book and sat down. He was sitting on his lap, his voice steady. He didn't raise it to answer Karen's charge. "Ma'am, I promise there's nothing dangerous in my bag. Like everyone else, I just want a calm trip." Karen's eyes were red with anger. "Peaceful flight? You want us to believe that? What are you hiding?" She stood between Tom and Karen and said in a strong but calm voice, "That's enough. We're not going to have that. Please take your seat, ma'am, and thank you for your patience." She then turned to talk to the other person. "Ladies and gentlemen, please stay cool. There's no reason to be scared. Please go back to your seats." The whispers in the cabin got louder, and Linda knew she had to calm Karen down. Before things got worse, she motioned for another flight attendant to help, and the two of them gently but firmly pushed Karen back into her seat. Karen kept protesting, her voice a low but angry growl, and Tom stayed. He sat down and watched Karen finally take a seat. Karen's eyes were still on him with suspicion, but he couldn't read them. He could feel the anxiety in the air, but he kept his cool. He knew it would be detrimental for him to fight, especially with so many people watching. Instead, he picked up his book, turned to the page where he had left off, and started reading again. Linda, speaking from the front of the cabin, told passengers that his calmness contrasted with the chaos. With another reassuring smile, she went to the kitchen to call the captain and tell him what was going on. As she picked up the speaker, she quickly looked back at Tom, who was there, just in case things got worse. Karen's eyes were still burning with suspicion, but she calmed down and sighed. Despite the engine noise, the passengers were tense. They looked at each other nervously, with some whispering and others pretending to be focused on their books or screens. Karen sat seething in her seat. She couldn't figure out why no one was paying attention to her. She looked around and caught glimpses of talk about her. She could feel it, but it didn't bother her because she knew she was right. Karen's. We look back at Tom. He was reading quietly, not bothered by the scene she had set up. In fact, his calmness annoyed her. How could he be so calm if he wasn't hiding anything? That was all she could think. If no one else sees it, she would. She would have to do something about it herself if she didn't act. Tom moved in his seat, feeling Karen's gaze on him. He quickly looked up and saw her looking at him. Her eyes were narrowed and her jaw was set. He knew that look all too well. It was the sigh of someone who was sure they had found a threat and wouldn't back down. Despite reading his book, he couldn't shake the feeling that things would get worse. Karen couldn't take it any longer. When she finally lost it, she unbuckled her seatbelt, got up, and walked down the aisle toward the people sitting next to her. He turned to watch as she walked quickly and with purpose. Tom looked up when he felt her coming up behind him and put down his book. He sat down on his lap and gazed directly into her eyes. Karen's voice was loud and clear, the low sound of the cabin. "I want to know what's in that bag right now." She pointed her finger at Tom. Tom stayed cool. "Ma'am, there's nothing in this bag that should worry you." he said in a steady voice. "Please calm down. You're making a scene." Linda sped down the aisle, her face showing worry. "Ma'am, please." She put a gentle hand on Karen's arm and told her, "You need to go back to your seat. You're bothering the other passengers." Karen told Linda, "Focus on Tom alone. I won't sit down until he opens that bag. I know he's hiding something. Something dangerous. I'm not going to let this plane be in danger. You all are blind to the truth, Tom." He glanced at Linda, who was attempting to maintain her composure. He could see worry and fear in her eyes. He kept his cool as things got out of hand and said, "Controlled, ma'am. My bag only. Has private things in it. I promise there's nothing dangerous here." Karen laughed quickly and sharply. "You make promises that you believe we should trust. You're not deceiving anyone. I've observed you since our last encounter. Once you've boarded, you're constantly checking your bag, as if you're afraid someone might discover what's inside." "Indeed, I have no fear of discovering what's inside. Call you out, Linda." She stood between Karen and Tom to act as a wall. Her voice was strong. "Enough already. Ma'am, you need to go back to your place right now. If you continue to make noise during the flight, I will have to call for help." Many people on the plane were watching the fight, Captain. Some leaned out into the aisle to get a better look. View. While some people talked to their neighbors in whispers, guessing what was going on, Tom stayed where he was. He kept his hands on his book and his face calm, aware that any movement could lead to misunderstandings and worsen the situation. Karen didn't pay attention to Linda. Her eyes were still on Tom. "I'm not going to sit down until someone does," she said. She said, "If no one is going to listen, I'll make sure they know what's going on here." Her voice got louder with each word. Wore her face red with anger, Linda turned to Tom and said, "Sir, I'm sorry, but could you please show her what's in your bag? If she sees that there's nothing to worry about, maybe everything will be fine." Tom glanced first at Linda, then at Karen, her face fixed in a determined scowl. He took a deep breath and nodded. He slowly removed his shoes to maintain peace and carefully retrieved a small pocket knife. He showed Karen and Linda the clear plastic case with his medicine in it and said, "This is what's in my bag." Tom said in a steady voice, "This is my medicine. I have a heart condition and need to carry this with me at all times." Linda smiled and nodded, pleased that there was no danger in the room. She then turned to Karen. "Please, let's put this behind us and finish the trip without any more problems." Karen shook her head in shock. Tom took a step closer and said, "No, that's not it. That can't be everything you're saying." "There's no way Tom could have been more calm, Ma'am. I'm not kidding." "Is this the truth? Please sit down." Karen looked around at the other riders for support. "Can't you all help her? See, he's trying to trick us. That's not right. We need to search him properly," Linda said as she stepped forward. "Ma'am, that's enough. Please sit down now, or I'll have to do something else." Karen ignored her, reaching out as if to grab Tom's bag before she could. Tom stopped her by, softly but firmly taking her wrist. His hold was firm, but Karen pulled her hand away and said, "Ma'am, please don't do this. There's no need for this kind of behavior." "Aren't you all in on it?" she asked, her eyes wide. "Aren't you all protecting him?" As she stepped back, her voice became increasingly high-pitched. Quickly, Linda waved to another flight attendant, who moved toward them and said, "Ma'am, please come with us." "We need to have a word with you in the back of the plane," Karen thought for a moment, as she looked around at the people who were staring at her with sympathy. Others disagreed with her, so she turned her gaze back to Tom, still convinced of his danger, but without any assistance from the firm. She finally followed the flight attendants to the back of the plane, even though she didn't want to. Tom watched her leave slowly and hesitantly. He could feel the other passengers' eyes on him, so he picked up his book again and tried to concentrate, to find his spot. Despite the thick, ion-filled air in the cabin and the loud whispers, Tom remained engrossed in his page. He didn't let the situation affect him. He had faced more challenging situations in the past. As Linda led Karen away, she glanced back at Tom and gave him a stern look. With a small nod of thanks, he nodded back, letting her know that he was aware of the stress they were both under. It wasn't over yet, but the immediate fear of things getting worse had subsided. Tom turned the page, his face filled with relief. Mask of calm. The air inside the cabin was tense as the plane flew slowly west through the clouds. People had gone back to their places, but many of them still looked back at the back of the crowded bus. On the plane where Karen had been taken, the noise of voices was louder and more filled with worry and speculation. He could feel the stares pulling him down, but he kept his eyes on his book and tried to look calm. Karen sat in the flight crew's designated seat at the back of the plane. She had her arms crossed, and her face was red with anger. Linda stood next to her and tried to talk sense into Karen, but Karen had already made up her mind. Showed anger. "I'm telling you he's lying. He has to be. People like him always have a story." "Always have a reason," Karen said. Linda kept her voice low and calmed her down. "Ma'am, I understand that you are. We were worried, but Mr. Johnson showed us his medicine, so there's no sign that he's a threat. Please try to cool down. We need to make sure everyone is safe, and the way you're acting right now sets off more alarms than anything else." Karen shook her head. She was furious and said, "You don't get it. You don't see it. He's dangerous. I know it." And if Linda sighed, realizing she was no longer able to reason with Karen, she nodded to Jim in, "There was another flight attendant nearby ready to help, ma'am. Please maintain your composure for the remainder of the flight. If you continue to make noise during the flight, we will need to call the police when we land." Karen's eyes got big, and she leaned back in her chair. She was quiet for a moment, but then she said, "You'll regret it." Linda would not listen to me, so she left Karen with Jim and went back down the hall to check on the situation. As other riders tried to calm them down and keep things from getting worse, as she got closer to Tom, she saw how other people quickly turned away as if they weren't looking. Tom looked up from his book when Linda stopped next to him. "Mr. Johnson," Linda said quietly, "I'm sorry for the trouble." "It's okay." Tom shook his head. "No, thank you," he said. "I know these things happen. I appreciate how you are." Linda thought for a moment and then said in a low voice that only Tom could hear, "I just wanted to make sure there's no... If anything is unclear, please let us know. We want to make sure you're safe and comfortable." Tom nodded, recognizing her sincerity. "Thank you. I just want to get to Los Angeles without any more trouble." Linda smiled a little and she kept walking down the aisle to check on other people. Tom watched her leave, and then he went back to reading his book to try to get his mind back on track, but the stress in the cabin made it hard. He could feel the eyes on him. He knew he had heard the whispers that came after Linda's talk with Karen. Should I say, or do something to calm down? Tom looked around. Taking a deep breath to check his mood, he stood up and carefully put his book down on the seat next to him. Then he reached into his pocket. He found his badge in his pocket. Though he didn't like it, he knew it might be the only way to calm things. He walked down the aisle and stopped at Linda's side. His voice was quiet but clear enough for everyone to hear. "Excuse me, could I have everyone's attention for a moment?" The quiet cabin shook as people turned to look at him. Tom clearly showed his badge. "I am Detective Tom Johnson. I'm an undercover agent for the New York Police Department, and I've been on duty with the medicine in my bag. Is due to a heart problem. I'm sorry if my behavior caused any worry, but I promise you there is no danger here." There was a moment of stunned quiet. Some people looking through the pass looked relieved, others surprised, and a few looked at each other. Many people felt at ease around Tom, who was cool and in charge. He turned to Linda, who gave him a small nod. I thanked him for trying to calm things down, but Karen's loud voice broke the silence. You're lying. This is just a cover. Since that badge is real, how do we know you're not hiding something dangerous? Tom turned around. Is that her face steady, ma'am? If you'd like, you can call my department and make sure I'm who I say I am. The number is on. I'm not here to hurt anyone. I'm just trying to do my job and get where I need to go safely. Karen's. Her face was red with anger, and her eyes were wide. No, I don't believe you. This is all a trick. You can't fool me, she said. Tom could see fear in Karen's eyes. He knew that she was panicking. The cabin began to rise again. No matter what he said, it didn't work. But he knew he had to stay calm and in charge, Ma'am Tom. I know you're scared, but I promise you there's nothing to worry about with me. Let's end the flight without... If there's more trouble when we land, let the police investigate. Karen shook her head. Her voice trembled as she spoke. No, I won't wait. I won't sit here and do nothing while you take care of yourself. After failing to finish her sentence, Linda stepped forward and said, Ma'am, please sit down. We've talked to Mr. Johnson. Everything is fine, and we need you to stay cool. Karen looked around and saw other people in the car. As people watched her, some with worry and others with disapproval, she slowly began to realize that she had no one to help her. She slumped back in her chair and shook her head once more. Tom looked at her for a moment, and then turned back to Linda to say thank you, said quietly. He felt eyes on him as he walked back to his seat, but he didn't pay attention to them. He sat down, picked up his book, and he opened it, but his mind wasn't on the pages. The flight was quiet, but tension remained. Thick, but not quite on the verge of chaos, people began to calm down. They went back to watching movies or reading books. Conversations. Linda moved quietly through the cabin, making sure everyone was comfortable, looking around every once in a while. She turned toward Tom and Karen, who were prepared to assist if necessary. Karen sat with her back to her face. She was pale, and her hands were shaking a little. She could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her and the judgment in their steps. She tried to understand why they didn't see what she saw and why they trusted Tom's words, but she found herself alone. Her fear was overwhelming, and she had to wait until they reached the land. Tom sat quietly with his eyes on his book, but he was aware of every movement around him, and his mind was awake. He knew this wasn't over, but hoped the worst was over. He focused on steady breathing, keeping his heart rate low and staying cool. The tension in Trip 287's cabin persisted despite the remaining hours of the trip. Anything could happen. Some people had gotten back to their normal lives after Tom's revelation, but others were still feeling tired. Looks at him in the back of the plane, where Karen was sitting alone and angry, where there was a lot of noise from conversations. The atmosphere was low and quiet, as though individuals were reluctant to agitate the tension that pervaded the atmosphere just before Linda's relocation. I was slowly walking through the aisles, reassuring people who needed it, and trying to keep things normal. She could feel the unease like a wave coming from Karen's seat in the back of the plane, where her eyes were burning with worry. Linda was frustrated and shocked, but she knew she had to keep things under control. She couldn't let things get worse. Jim closely observed Karen at the rear of the house. She was sitting with her arms crossed and a stubborn look on her face. The customer was different from others Jim had dealt with. Karen's level of fear and anger was frighteningly high. He leaned over to Linda as she drew closer, saying in a low voice, "She's not moving." Jim, who was angry, told Linda, "Quiet, Elle. I don't think she's going to calm down any time soon." Linda nodded and looked over at Karen. "We need to make sure she doesn't bother anyone else. Could you stay with her and try to keep her calm?" Contact the captain to determine if we need additional safety measures. Jim agreed and said, "I'll do my best." As she made her way to the front of the plane and into the cockpit, Captain Samuel Harris looked up from his seat. He asked Linda, "What's going on?" Linda responded, "We've managed to calm things down for now. But the woman, Karen, is still angry. Even though Tom has shown her his badge, she doesn't believe he's telling the truth. I told her everything, and I'm afraid she might try something else." The captain frowned. "We can't have another explosion. It may panic people, so we may have to control her to keep everyone safe." Linda agreed. "Given the gravity of the situation, I will closely monitor her. Jim is now with her, trying to keep her calm. We will try not to use restraints, but we will be prepared." Captain Harris said, "A slight nod indicates that I should keep you informed. If things get bad, we'll call air traffic control and have security ready." Linda exited the cabin, her mind filled with contingency plans to maintain Karen's composure and prevent further incidents. She returned to the rear of the plane, where Jim was keeping watch over Karen's location. Karen looked up as Linda walked up to her, her eyes flashing with anger. "Are you here to apologize to?" "Say yes." Linda shook her head. "No, ma'am," she said in a soft but strong voice. "I'm here to make sure you're right." "Okay, everyone needs to stay cool and work together so we can get where we're going safely." Karen's jaw clenched. "If you say cooperative, you really mean obeying. You want me to do nothing while that man carries out his plan? I won't do it, and I can't believe that you all believe his lies." Linda took a deep breath. "Mr. Johnson is telling the truth. He has shown his credentials, and there's no reason to think he's a threat. Your behavior, on the other hand, is worrying. Like everyone else on the plane, stay cool and in your seat. If you are unable to comply, we will have to continue our journey." Karen's eyes get even bigger. "Are you planning to arrest me?" she asks. "I'm the one trying to keep everyone safe," she says. "Safe." Linda met Karen's steady eyes and said, "Ma'am, we're in charge of the safety of everyone on this flight. If you keep making a fuss, we'll have to hold you down for the rest of the flight, so please try to stay cool. Stay put, Karen." She glared at Linda, but something about her voice must have hit home because she leaned back in her seat. She was angry, but her voice dropped just right. "If something happens, it's on you all," she said. Karen seemed to be following Linda's orders, which made Linda happy. Linda nodded and instructed Jim to monitor Karen closely. Return to her role of monitoring passengers, providing them with smiles and reassurances to alleviate their stress in the cabin. As Linda walked down the aisle, the atmosphere was still thick, but not about to boil over. Tom watched her come up the aisle. He quietly watched and was aware of every cabin shift and movement from his position. The way Linda's eyes moved back and forth between him and the back of the plane showed that she was under a lot of stress. Tom looked up when she got to his place and asked in a calm voice, "How's it going back there?" Linda sighed and said, "She's still mad, but she's staying in her place for now. We will closely monitor her behavior. I'm sorry this has caused you so much trouble. We're making every effort to address an issue that's causing us difficulties." Tom nodded. "I know you are. You're handling it well. Is there anything I can do to help?" Linda smiled at him and told him to stay calm. The less we argue, the better. He went back to reading, but his senses were still very sharp. He could still sense the subtle presence of stress in the air. There was an undercurrent that could resurface at any moment. He knew this wasn't over, but he hoped things would get better. The plane would remain silent until they touched down at the rear. Karen sat stiff in her seat. She couldn't calm down. She was becoming increasingly agitated as she believed that everyone was aligned with Tom, oblivious to the danger she could clearly perceive. She didn't say much because she knew that any more outbursts would make things worse for her. Jim stood nearby and watched. Karen's hands gripped her arms as if she were holding on to something, revealing the angst in her eyes. She held herself back from doing something dramatic, and he stayed ready to step in if needed. Minutes went by. After an hour, the flight settled into a tense rhythm, with people quietly doing their own things. She made more rounds, keeping an eye on both Tom and Karen. She knew she was the thin line, keeping the peace at last. Linda walked up to Jim and said, "I think we're okay for now. Please monitor the situation and inform me if anything unexpected occurs." Jim nodded while maintaining eye contact with Karen. "We'll do that," Linda said as she turned to leave, her mind still on staying calm. She knew that things could get worse at any time, but for now they were able to handle it. The plane kept going through the sky, carrying its passengers to their goal. Each of them was hoping that the tension would not come back in Karen's seat, and her thoughts kept going back to Tom and the threat she posed. She believed he was posing, but she chose to remain silent for the time being. Her anger was mounting as she waited for another opportunity to present itself. Spark and Tom, who seemed calm on the outside, stayed alert because he knew that his "it" was crucial to maintain composure as the hour progressed and the flight continued for everyone. As everyone on board hoped for a smooth landing, the plane began to descend and the seatbelt sign went off. A soft ding went off on a sign, and Captain Harris's voice came over the speaker, reassuring everyone. As they got closer to Los Angeles, people moved around in their seats and stretched. Others were putting away computers and books to get ready for landing. The tension that had been in the cabin for most of the A's people got ready for the end of the journey. The flight seemed to get lighter. Tom Johnson noticed a slight tilt in the plane. As it started to go down, he put his book down and put it back in his carry-on bag, making sure his medicine was safe. Once everything was safe, he quickly looked back at the plane to see Karen sitting still under Jim's watchful eye. She hadn't moved at all. She let out another angry scream, but Tom could tell she wasn't close based on how she stood and how her eyes darted around. Linda made sure everyone was secure and prepared for landing by taking one final walk down the aisle. She paused briefly and smiled at Tom's seat. "We're almost there," she said quietly. "Thank you for your patience, Tom." I nodded. "I just want to get through this without any more problems. You've handled everything well." Linda nodded back. Linda continued down the road. "I like how calm he is. Let's hope things stay quiet until we get to the ground." Jim was signaling her down the aisle, so she sped up. When she got to the back, Jim was waiting for her. "Karen has been talking to herself. She's upset again," I said in a low voice. "We need to be ready in case she does that." "Try something new." Linda looked at Karen, who was looking straight ahead. Karen's face lit up with anger. Linda knelt down. She spoke softly next to her. "Ma'am, we're about to land. Please stay calm and stay in your seat." Almost there, Karen looked at Linda and said in a sharp whisper, "This isn't over. I'm not letting him get away. No matter what he plans, you'll all see." Linda felt cold, but forced a smile. "Please just stay. Seated until we land. We'll take care of everything once we get there." Karen didn't respond, but she didn't make any noise. No moves to get up either. Linda inhaled deeply, returned to her position, and instructed Jim to remain vigilant. The plane continued to descend, revealing the city of Los Angeles below. Linda hoped that once they got there, landed, everything would go smoothly. Everyone exhaled with relief as the plane touched down. Despite the regular sounds of people unbuckling their seatbelts and bags rustling throughout the cabin, Tom remained motionless. He stayed seated because he knew there was no need to hurry. He watched as other people got up and started getting their bags from the "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen" Over the speaker came Captain Harris's voice. "Welcome to Los Angeles," he said. "Please remain in your current position until the seat belt sign turns off and the plane comes to a complete stop. Thank you for your assistance at the gate and have a pleasant stay." Tom could feel the plane taxiing to the gate. I glanced out the window and observed the airport staff preparing for their arrival. Linda moved toward him, her face calm, but she said in a soft voice, "We've called airport security and they'll be waiting for us at the gate." Tom nodded. "That's right. Thank you." It was probably for the best. Upon the plane's stop and the activation of the seatbelt sign, everyone stood up. Linda and Jim positioned themselves near Karen, prepared to intervene if necessary, as they were eager to leave the boat. Tom stayed in. From his seat, he knew he would be one of the last people to leave. He could hear mumbling voices, filled with a mix of satisfaction and curiosity. When the cabin door opened, 2 security guards in dress walked in. Linda pointed them toward the back. One of the police officers, a tall, calm man, spoke to Karen Satt in a low, authoritative voice. "Tones, ma'am, we need you to come with us. We need to talk to you about what happened on the trip." She shook her head and said, "No, I'm not going anywhere. I haven't done anything wrong. It's him. He's the one you care about." She should be arrested, as she pointed wildly at Tom. The officer maintained his composure. Karen quickly stood up and said, "You're all in." "You're protecting him," the second officer, a woman with a firm grip, said. "I'm the only one who sees the truth." He took Karen by the arm and said, "Ma'am, we need you to calm down. Please come with us, and we'll take care of everything." Karen attempted to distance herself, her voice rising into an angry cry. "No, this isn't right. You can't do this." Officers maintained their composure as they guided Karen to the exit, allowing everyone in the cabin to hear her protest. People observed in silence, with some expressing shock and others expressing happiness at the resolution of the problem. Linda was right behind them. Tom stayed seated and watched Karen get off the plane to ensure everything was okay. He could feel other riders' eyes on him, but he didn't pay attention to them. Instead, he concentrated on the consistent professionalism of the rider. After a moment, Officer Linda came back to his side. Her face showed a mix of joy and exhaustion. Linda softly stated, "We've also informed the police about the situation, as they led her to a holding area for questioning. We will thoroughly examine the situation." Tom said, "Thank you. You've handled everything professionally." Linda gave me a small smile and said, "Thank you. I'm glad we were able to get through this without any more problems." Problems. As the last of the people got off, Tom stood there getting his carry-on bag. He walked down the aisle. The stress in his shoulders started to melt away, and he gave Linda a nod. As he walked toward the entrance for the last time before getting off the plane, the cool air of the jet bridge hit him. Tom witnessed security guards leading Karen through the terminal as she continued to argue. He could hear her words echoing off the walls. He observed them escorting her to a secure location, her objections diminishing as they removed her. Tom turned around. He walked steadily toward the luggage claim area. The events of the flight played over and over in his mind, but he knew he had to move. He managed the situation to the best of his abilities. He had dealt with worse situations in his job, but the weight of wrongdoing was too much for him to bear. When Tom got to the baggage claim area, the accused person was still there. He took a deep breath and was ready to move on with his day. He could hear the people on Flight 287 talking quietly behind him. They were conversing with each other and glancing in Karen's direction. The flight was becoming less tense. The noise of the airport was replaced by the excitement of arriving in a new city. But Tom's day wasn't over yet. He knew there would be questions, notes and reflections, but for now he was content to let go. He could hear the airport noise, which reminded him that life went on even after fights and misunderstandings. As Tom walked toward the exit, he felt determined. Today had been challenging, yet he had handled it with determination. In the end, the only actions possible were honor and respect.